Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are excited to get started. Today is session 3 of our 4-part series, Ready for Recovery. We are just delighted in bringing greetings to you today. On behalf of our Mayor Muriel Bowser, our Mayor's Office on Community Affairs Leadership, and our Chief Service Officer, whom you'll hear from in just a moment, I bring you greetings. My name is Alexis Squire, and I am the Deputy Director of Partnerships and Engagement for Serve DC. So here we are today. Before we begin, I just want to set the stage and give us a little context of why we are here and why we are certainly ready for recovery. We all have been experiencing and understanding and surviving what has been 2 crises here recently. One is our public health emergency, COVID-19. The other is the civil unrest and social injustice with brown and Black people across our country and across our world. And so we thought it was incredibly important for us to get together, to lean in with our valued partners and really share what we know and get the best and the brightest to share what they know so that we are well equipped to recover. We've been listening, we've been learning, we've been thinking, we've been strategic, and then we've also been aligning. And so we heard our leadership a few months ago really come out with a bold statement of how we reopen DC and that we reopen it in a better space, in a better place than we were before we closed. And so our commitment to reopen and making sure that our residents and our communities are vibrant, are resilient, and also are based in equity. And so here we are. Because of that, we came together and said, hey, we want to be a part of this recovery, and we want to make sure that everyone, especially our nonprofit partners and our philanthropic partners, and our residents, our volunteers and community engagers are all prepared. And so here we are, we're excited to have you. I'm not gonna stay before you long. What I'm going to do is just do a little of our housekeeping. So if you would just stick with us, we're gonna share how you get the maximum out of this experience. So to ensure accessibility, we do have recording, we have streaming and closed captioning available. So please check that out within your toggle. We also are going to encourage you to remain on mute so that we're able to hear our presenters. We're also going to have the Q&A, so please keep your questions coming and make sure that they are put in a parking lot. We're going to put them in that chat and we will get to them after both of our discussions. Please, please, please encourage others to join on this important conversation today. Our hashtags are R for R, Ready for Recovery, hashtag Serve DC, and then hashtag Ready for Recovery. And last but not least, we have a post-event survey. Definitely want you to check that out and give us your feedback. This is not a one-time conversation that we're having with you. We are really encouraging you to really be a part of this, share your experiences, your feedback with us so that we all can lean in and get better. Today's agenda. All right, we're going to start with our welcome and introductions, which I am doing now. After that, we will have our first panel discussion, which is really a Q&A, a one-on-one with 3 folks, with our Chief Service Officer and 2 experts in the communications and equity and inclusion space. We'll have panel number 2, which is a dynamic conversation about racial justice. And then we'll have our events and initiatives, and our director will come back and offer us closing remarks. Today's focus. So the first focus of us for today is for us to magnify methods of connecting people to purpose. At Serve DC, that is what we want to be able to do is connect you, our people, our partners to the purpose, and that is really edifying and creating a city that is one that we all can thrive in. Number 2, we want to define and discuss what is racial equity and what does the journey look like, especially as we talk through our nonprofit and philanthropic sectors. Number 3, we want to discuss how do corporations and organizations intentionally center racial justice, and that includes their policies, their programs, and their practices. Number 4, we want to highlight the trends and stories of BIPOC partnerships. And finally, number 5, we want to discuss how funders and nonprofits can authentically align and invest in resources so we get this equity work right. Okay, without further ado, I will introduce you to our fearless leader, our Chief Service Officer, Ms. Eris T. Scales. She is a philanthropic, a public-private partnerships, that's a mouthful, expert, and she's strategic in all things. And so we will hear a dynamic conversation with her and our panelists. Eris?
Thank you, Alexis. Hello, everyone. I am so thrilled to be here today. This, as we've said, is a 4-part series. The first part really looking at the power of volunteers and individuals in terms of stepping up, responding, and supporting during these times and even beyond. And today we are just taking a little bit of a different lens where we can bring together thought leaders, movers and shakers, practitioners who are coming from the philanthropic space, who are coming from the private sector, who are coming from the not-for-profit, because collectively, we all play a role in making sure that we are building back better, that we are addressing issues that are impacting marginalized communities. And I don't want anyone to feel that they are immune from that process. And so I think oftentimes we think because we're in the philanthropic space or we're in the public sector or the not-for-profit sector that we're doing the good work, and we absolutely are. But there's always ways for us to continue to look at how we are making sure that the actions that we're taking with regards to our partnerships, our programs, our operations, our procurements, are really aligned with our missions and how we want to advance the work. So I cannot wait to hunker down and dive in deeply around this conversation with my 2 panelists, Ty and Brittany, who I'll introduce to you in a moment, as well as with our Commissioner Edward Jones and Timmy Bennett, as well as Aisha from the Meyer Foundation. So with that, we wanted to kind of start with a poll. Is that correct? There it is, our audience poll. We know that when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, marginalized populations, underserved populations, how we do this racial equity work, that we're all coming from it from a different point on this journey, that we all come from it with a little bit of a different lens. And so part of this conversation today is really getting us to level set around what are appropriate terms and how do we apply those terms. And so what we want to know from you is, where do you feel you are on your racial equity journey? And we'll leave this up for a moment. Are you just starting out? Are you fairly far? Do you feel like you are there and you should be on one of these panels? I'm going to take it as well. Do we have our Vanna White who's going to show us our results? Okay, so this is a great cross sector of folks who are just starting out at 34%, some who feel that they're fairly far, which is wonderful. So that means we should be having some good exchange and dialogue along today's conversation. And then we have 17% who are there. So we want to know who you are, because next time when we host one of these, we'll be reaching out to you to participate with us. So thank you so much for that opportunity to kind of level set and see where we are today. Well, without further ado, what I would love to do is bring up our panelists. Our first panelist today that's joining me is Brittany Harris. Brittany is the Vice President of Learning and Innovation for the Winters Group, which provides consulting services to corporations and nonprofits to foster equitable and inclusive environments. In Brittany's role, just so you can have a little more context, she designs programs and experiences that build competency around diversity, equity, inclusion, and meeting people where they are on their journey. So she's going to meet each of you where you are today. Thank you. Hello, Brittany. Welcome.
Thank you.
Fantastic. And then also joining me today is Ty Wingfield. Ty is the Senior Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Weber Sandwick, a global public relations firm. And in this role, she advises CEOs, chief communication officers, and diversity leaders across a broad range of industries to develop and measure diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. Hey, Ty, where are you?
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, ladies, so much for joining. I am ready to just dive in. We had quite a conversation, what was it, about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, as we were, getting our thoughts together, wanting to make sure we were presenting ourselves in our best selves possible, and really wanting to think about the things that we wanted to discuss. And so there were lots of good nuggets that came out of that conversation. And I wanted to start with one of the things that came up was around value. So since we're talking today about aligning our actions with our intentions. And when I say that, and when we say that, we're really discussing, or we're really referencing, right? We have these great missions. We have great teams. We have strong boards. We're bringing all these different resources to serve our communities. But we want to make sure that when we peel back and we look at what's really happening on the inside of these organizations, that the actions are aligned with the intentions that we put out publicly. And so one of the things that came up in our conversation with that was around starting with values. And so I want to start with you, Ty. When we talk about the values of an organization, how does that relate to aligning your intentions and your actions, right? Particularly as it pertains to being, here we go, an anti-racist company or organization. What does that mean, and what should our participants be thinking about?
Yeah, sure. No, thank you again for having me. It's an honor to be here and to speak with you and the other panelists on this important topic. Values are so critical. I think, oftentimes we as consumers or as, just everyday citizens, we can look at a company website and see values and assume it's really just language on a page, right? And from time to time, some organizations also get kind of lost or misguided because they're not making decisions with their core values in mind. Your values are really who the organization is, right? We know an organization is an entity, it's a business, but it's the people behind it, the people it touches that really make up the morals and the values of what this organization stands for, why it exists, what its higher purpose is. And it doesn't matter if you are in the retail industry, if you're a nonprofit, if you're in oil and gas, every organization has or should have values that really reflect what they stand for and how they operate. So as we think about and as we hear, companies articulate their commitments to being anti-racist or equitable, it's really about, tying all of their efforts back and thinking through what their values are as an organization. What do they stand for? What do they stand against? And if you really think about and keep values at the center of every decision that you make as an organization, then that's it's your guidepost, right, for how you operate. So you have to consider your company purpose, your values, your goals, and how you develop products and services, and how you communicate and market to your stakeholders. All of that should really come through the lens of your values, your higher purpose, what you stand for as an organization. And again, it goes well beyond what an organization says on paper, but really how it's lived throughout the organization and externally. I think J&J is a really good example of a company that really takes to heart its credo, its values. It's something that every employee can articulate, but they also have a way of understanding how to bring their values to life through the business, through how they treat their employees, how they treat their patients. And you're seeing that in some of the examples that J&J produces. So I think in keeping that, again, keeping values front and center can help guide organizations as they arguably go through the biggest transformation we've ever seen, right? Really stripping away a lot of the biased and racist policies and systems that have been in place since many of these organizations were founded, and really shifting how they operate moving forward. So standing firm in your values is the way to start that work.
Brittany, because you're working with corporations and nonprofits around, building out their strategies, do you start with values, or where do you start with organizations or entities when you go in and they're like, we want to be more equitable, we want to be more diverse? It's like, where do you go? Where do you start with that?
Yeah, and so values, huge, right? And so one of the things that we often underscore, and Ty said it, is that there's one thing to sort of espouse values, is another thing to sort of enact them. And a lot of times there are cultural nuances at play within organizations, and culture is a key word here. I define that, or we define that rather, as sort of the behavioral interpretation of how organizations live out their values. Because more often than not, the values are very, very clear, but how I live out those values or enact them as a Black woman within that organizational system could be perceived very differently than my white counterparts. And more often that is, that is what is behind a lot of the disparities and experiences within many of these well-intentioned organizations, right? And so that's top of mind for folks now, not only values, but also what we value. And so part of like disruption, especially within, and I'm going to be frank, many corporate America, nonprofit, white-led institutions, which obviously make up most of our sort of ecosystem, oftentimes there's a disruption that needs to be made in what we value. And so it's not by happenstance that, for example, equity and like racial justice work is underfunded. It's because a lot of times value is oftentimes associated with those departments or centers of excellence associated with money, revenue, which undermines lived experience, which undermines the value in people, which undermines what should be a focus on humanity. And that's something that we see happening in real time today, especially in response to, this sort of awakening of sorts around racial justice, anti-racism. And so we start with values, certainly, but also culture. Like, what is the culture supporting, and who is the culture supporting, and how is it supporting folks differently based off of who they are within that organizational system? So yeah, that's a start point. And obviously learning and education, like is from my perspective, a big part of that. I have tracked that, certainly in our work, and as much as there is this inclination to act, Eris, a lot of folks, because there hasn't been a pause around, okay, what paradigm models or shifts need to happen in order for me to act differently, consciously, and in a way that is disruptive. Like, that pause hasn't happened. There's kind of just been like this sense of urgency. And so sometimes that can be stifling, especially when we're trying to move beyond the rhetoric.
I love that. And you know what? I really value the distinction you made between values, right? What organizations, entities, companies value, and what we value. Like, there's, we have values by which guide how we move forward. And even those values may not necessarily be what we individually value, right? Or how we show up. And so I do value that distinction and those kind of cultural nuances. And one of the things that we navigated here at Serve DC was the urgency, the resistance to jump out too quickly in response, right? Our deputy director, Alexis, alluded to how we listened, we heard leaders about what was going on the ground, and we've been thinking about how we shift and pivot our service deliveries, you know, our programming, et cetera, to be responsive. And so now we've seen a lot of organizations, a lot of businesses pushing out statements on paper. My public commitment, right? Or here's an extra, and I always take from my philanthropic, you know, gurus who are coming up, but you know, here's our public commitment of $500,000 for Black women or organizations or entities in these communities. Fabulous. However, it's very urgent, irresponsive. So to your point about taking a moment to pause and just stepping back and learning a little more, I'm going to imagine that those are some of the recommendations or approaches that you may take with your clients. This is to both of you. You know, so what recommendations or what approaches would you urge to our listeners, our participants who are joining today, who want to go? Like and this is work, right? This has been going on. I mean, these systemic issues have been happening. So people are tired. We want to get it done. But we also know that it's the long game. It's a long haul. And you have to be astute and aware and informed before you jump out there. Thoughts on that?
I want to call out the like sense of urgency. I want to call out the sense of urgency because it's not even just like sense of urgency. It's not just like a sort of like a practice. I think contextually, and so we're existing in this global pandemic. Obviously, the murder of George Floyd in the context of the pandemic really created this context by which, you know, white America had to sit with and experience in like real time some of the like manifestation of pain, you know, dehumanization that Black folks obviously know all too well. And so for the first time, so to speak, there's like a pause because of this global pandemic, and like, you know, whiteness, for lack of better terms, is on like the main stage, right? And because it's on the main stage, and I'm giving y'all this just as context, it kind of like is this inherent sense of discomfort with like this goodness that we've learned and is oftentimes afforded to it is, and not new to more specifically Black folks in marginalized communities, creates a sense of awakening. We need to act, immediate reaction. What do we got to do? We got to do something. We got to say something. And so, like you said, that look like statements, communications, donations made to even, I guess, more mainstream nonprofit organizations. That pattern of, you know, sense of urgency isn't just sense of urgency. That's a pattern closely researched associated with like white supremacy culture. I offer this so that we can begin to like name. And so as organizations are thinking about how they center justice, anti-racism, equity, which is different from just diversity and inclusion work, we also have to be able to like name cultural patterns as they are. That in and of itself is a form of like resistance and disruption. And so sense of urgency looks like I want to do something without necessarily giving equal attention to one, strategy, as you mentioned. And so strategy involves bringing the folks to the table who are most impacted by your decisions, bringing the folks to the table who have been harmed by sort of like the history and context by which your industry exists, bringing those folks to the table and also paying them for it, because emotional labor, you know, is real. And so when we are supporting our organizations in, again, this like unlearning or paradigm shift, right? This means disrupting the notion that your leaders, just because they are leaders, know what's best, right? This is actually time for us to figure out ways to, you know, rethink that. It also means disrupting like this notion of sort of paternalism. I'm just going to go in and fix. And so a lot of times those statements that we read, that we saw were around, you know, maybe we can just donate money. Maybe we need to, you know, put a program in place without necessarily investing in the organizations who are already doing the work on the ground. And so even disrupting it in that sense. And then I'll add that one of the reactions that I didn't see, that I wish I would have saw in more organizations, and we're really coaching our leaders to own, is the acknowledgement of complicity. And so in as much as you are now experiencing this awakening and you care and your heart is in the right place, let's also just sort of own our complicity as an organization, as an industry in this system. Because when we do that, we can now talk about repair. And so what can an organization do to now integrate reparations? as part of their strategy, right? Whether it's internally, whether it's externally. And so those are the things that I think that's also kind of what differentiates organizations who are espousing a commitment to anti-racism and justice and a commitment to kind of just like, you know, diversity or how diversity has been understood.
Yeah. Ty, what about you? I mean, because you are advising CEOs and chief communication officers, you know, all type A's and corporations who want to move forward faster. How do you get that moment to step back and pause, you know?
Yeah, you know, I think one thing to also keep in mind, right, this is absolutely the right thing to do, right? Having an equitable society, equitable workplaces is right. But, you know, we're working with businesses, right? So businesses are not doing much just to be altruistic. I think it's important to also underscore, and this sort of goes back to the sense of urgency, that having a diverse, equitable, and inclusive organization has implications on your bottom line, right? You are able to secure a competitive advantage if you are investing in this work now. 10 years from now, if organizations that have made these statements and have had listening sessions and made donations stop there, they will find themselves behind the curve and behind other organizations that have taken action to really, you know, build this diverse and equitable workplace that we're all committing to do. So I think that's also just important to keep in mind. And you know, many organizations, I think, understand that theoretically, but in practice struggle to understand what does that mean, and then how do we get our employees to really live it and drive it through the business. One piece that, you know, we've sort of glossed over in the discussions around the pandemic, sort of, you know, in relation to George Floyd and the sense of urgency, is the Amy Cooper example. And I think as we talk about workplaces and business, that's such an important example. And we talk about, we mentioned complicity and sort of owning our own role in this. That example, and seeing, you know, Amy Cooper's reaction that day in the park, you have to also just understand a little bit more about her background. She's a white liberal woman. She had a fairly senior level role at a financial organization that did decide to let her go, rightfully so. But you have to think about who, you know, what impact she had on her direct reports' promotions, and who she gave visible assignments to, and how she treated other employees. I mean, there are many Amy Coopers in our organizations who will say, I'm not racist, right? I stand for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm a woman, right? I'm experiencing bias every day. And really thinking about and being honest about what's happening in your culture. And I'm so glad you mentioned culture in the way of values, because culturally, how are your people living and managing and making these decisions day to day and bringing their own biases to play that no one would ever know, right? I mean, she would never go into a workplace and make a racist statement. That doesn't mean she isn't making racist decisions. So one, I think, going back to your earlier question, Eris, about all of the work that organizations have done, I mean, I do want to underscore that these actions are all worthwhile, but they're very much a part of the current corporate playbook. And they're very much a starting point of an organization's journey, right? For employees, for their customers, their partners. There is no playbook or one-size-fits-all approach to building an equitable and anti-racist organization, but where you start is by, again, really taking a hard look at how every aspect of your business and your culture influences your day-to-day practices, with an eye for how it impacts every person your organization touches. Many organizations have blind spots, as we know. And first, you know, to make this long-term change, right, it's not immediate. You will not see results in 3 months, 6 months, maybe not even a year. But the sustainable change requires that you first understand what's broken in your systems. And that requires, as a first step, taking a comprehensive look at the soft stuff. So prevailing attitudes, perceptions, beliefs, behaviors that build or breach an equitable and inclusive experience for your stakeholders. And also taking a look at the hard stuff, right? Your policies, your processes, your systems that are embedded in your workforce, embedded in your business and your products and services, and possibly stand in the way of serving as an equitable employer, business leader, or contributor to society, right? Those, the results of that deep sort of understanding and assessment of what's happening, what's broken, that is what provides you the long-term roadmap for real and measurable progress. And that's how we advise, where we advise our clients start, and it's looking at every aspect of their business.
I love that. Thank you so much for giving those concrete, examples of what organizations, businesses can be and should be looking at. One question or one statement you made was blind spots, and they're giving us the 10-minute mark. Oh my goodness. Okay, so we're like, but what's blind spots? Real quick, what would be considered blind spots for organizations or businesses?
One, I'll just give one example that we see a lot with our clients is the leadership archetype, right? And these are, again, it goes to more of the soft things. It's harder to put a finger on, but it's these, you have to assume at a certain level, everyone has, a general foundation and has the skills needed to advance, right? But then whether or not they make it into decision roles is based on assumptions and culture that assume a leader looks, acts, or sounds a certain way, right? And those decisions are made by individuals who are already in positions of power who fit into that leadership archetype. And so those blind spots, right? We have mostly leaders who are at the helm and have control over what will happen or not when it comes to building diverse, inclusive, and equitable organizations. They decide how much, that work gets funded, what gets implemented, executed. If those leaders have blind spots in the way that they're tapping on the shoulder of someone else or saying this person shows up as a leader, that's harder to tackle and address, right? If those are those are the people in the organization who are responsible for really driving this work forward. So that's one example. There are many other examples of blind spots. I'm sure Brittany has some examples as well, but that's one I can think of pretty immediately.
Fantastic. Brittany, I don't know if you want to share a couple blind spots. I did want to do a closing question for you before I took it to our audience. So one, if you have blind spots you want to share, please do. But the other is that I know that the Winners Group is working on a book around Black fatigue. Whew, yeah, and it's like, what is that about?
So I'll answer your question real quick for the blind spots. Every day in organizations, anytime you hear cultural fit, anytime you hear we're a meritocracy, anytime you hear we only recruit from top schools, anytime you hear stuff like, we will listen if you said it differently. Those are really, practical examples of how blind spots, or even, I even toy with the term blind spots because a lot of this stuff could be argued to be sort of like even conscious forms of like bias and isms. Black fatigue, and I'm glad you asked, Eris. It actually came out today. For those who are not familiar, the Winters Group is a global diversity and inclusion firm owned and founded by a Black woman, Mary Frances Winters. And her book, Black Fatigue, I got it here because she sent me my signed copy, is really a term that captures much of what Black communities experience, how racism, how experiencing, white supremacy more broadly has impacted our mind, our body, our souls, how we're not just dealing with the organizational nuances, but also how just by existing, we're experiencing a toll on our body, right? And so she uses the term Black fatigue to really name this. And I'll just offer, and as much as a lot of, like white allies are out there reading, about white fragility. I just want to affirm that this is a tool to really begin to understand our experiences in a way that doesn't perpetuate emotional labor. She teased someone and said, like, this is your proverbial Black friend. This gets me on the topic, though, of sort of like the work of organizations owning that part of this anti-racism equity work also means like the work around trauma, right? And so racism, isms, there is an impact on the body. And so one of the things that there's an impact on the mind that shows up in how individuals, come to work. And so I'm seeing something on the screen, then having to hop on a Zoom, seeing something on social media, like that on social media, then having to hop on a Zoom call, then having to kind of move forward with my day-to-day. And there's a toll involved in that. And so we have really been encouraging our leaders to think about how you also be responsive to that. You know what I mean? How you be responsive to that, from whether it is offering into your pay structure, right? Justice bonuses, emotional tax bonus, how you restructure your bereavement leave to really, or grief leave to honor the lived experiences of those who are experiencing, racism, who are experiencing not just a global pandemic, but like, trauma in real time. And so Black Fatigue, the book is out today. It's certainly worth affirming. And as organizations begin to think about how they even curate learning around this stuff, avoid the inclination to like, people rightfully so, organizations that are pulling together task forces, more often than not, that are made up of the people who are most impacted by inequity. And I would just, avoid that inclination to create an additional burden for folks who are not getting paid to do so. You know what I mean? And so the fatigue is real. And to the extent that you can actually begin to put policy, practice, and money behind the folks who are doing this work, that ends up being part of the work too. So thanks for bringing up Black Fatigue. That is out today, as a matter of fact.
Oh my goodness, I didn't even know it came out today. Look at the timing of that. Congratulations. Okay, so we literally have about 5 minutes left, and I have a ton of questions in here, but there are two that I want to get at. One is around whether this is buzz, and the second, just to kind of precurse it, is how to support those new in the space. So the first, right, is equity, is this, diversity, is inclusion, is this just buzz? Or is it literally something that has to be addressed for sustainable solutions and outcomes for organizations and businesses? I know what I think, but I want to hear from the experts.
So I'll just start quickly. For any organization or individual that assumes this is buzz and ignores it, they will be left behind, right?
Mm-hmm.
The demographic of our country is shifting. Not only that, employees are demanding change, consumers are demanding change, shareholders are demanding change, and I hope and feel very strongly that that pressure will continue to mount and will force organizations to shift their thinking, their systems, their processes, their operations, if they are not willing to do that proactively. And so especially as we see this younger generation come in that is more impassioned and outspoken and thoughtful about change, I don't think that, this is something that can be ignored or sort of put into a space of this is the new buzzword. It will not go away. And it's important that organizations really prioritize it.
Yeah, I plus one that it's a buzzword if the organization and leaders want it to be a buzzword. Organizations and leaders, we found ways to put people on the moon. We found ways to build robots. We can absolutely find ways to embed equity into practice, into policies and into the organizational norm. But it certainly does being a buzzword for those organizations where commitment just doesn't exist. And that's just a reality. It's fatiguing, but that's just a reality.
That's right. Yeah, this is not a buzz. It cannot be a buzz. And it is, again, hence why we're having this conversation with leaders and representatives from various different, I call them verticals. It's not also just the responsibility of one industry or vertical. This has to be embedded from government to the philanthropic to the private, across all different of our industries that are serving and supporting our economies and our people and our communities. And so the last one, and we'll do this quickly, for leaders and emerging managers, folks who are coming into organizations and businesses who are new, and they're immediately recognizing maybe some white dominant culture and norms that are embedded and woven into practices, and they want to challenge it or raise it, address it. What are some recommendations for how they approach and raise that without making leaders feel resistant, hesitant, or, I say get that tight neck? How do they raise and address that to start chipping away?
Yeah, I think that there's power in the collective. And so one of the things we are seeing in corporate America, y'all, and so I don't know if y'all were following a couple months ago, young woman out of Adidas, Black woman, I think she had to have been in her, I think she mentioned being in her late 20s, got some employees together, post the organization, putting out their statement. And so this is like organizing. I think about what organizing looks like in the corporate context. I think that is a skill set to be transferred, because I do think that shared risk is something that is necessary when you are operating in organizational systems, especially as a Black person or another, person of color. And so really identifying ways to build a collective, identifying those folks who you trust, who are also sort of like, disruptors, who have influence but are curious, right? And so I think about sort of like a bell curve of folks who you want to engage in any sort of change management. You don't necessarily want to focus on the folks who are just not with it, not bought in. You kind of want to focus on those folks who are curious, have influence, and see where you can bring them along in their understanding, right? And so for emerging leaders, for folks who may not have as much positional power, I think the extent to which you can build a collective and ask the right questions. You know what? I am new to the organization, realize that the organization has espoused this commitment. Can you point me in the direction of where I could find how this is playing out, what this sort of looks like tangibly, like really asking the questions from a place of curiosity, and then, leveraging leveraging what we have known to work around social media. And so I think we're experiencing a lot of resistance. Organizations are experiencing resistance, but are moving because of sort of like the external push. And so employees are speaking up anonymously, but using social media as a channel. And so really just kind of thinking about organizing, you leveraging the collective, asking the questions, but then also leveraging channels like social media, and we've learned about it, as a mechanism for accountability. I don't think that can be done alone, though. That is certainly not anything that can be taken on alone, especially if you're not already a leader or in a position of power.
We literally have 2 minutes. Is there anything else you would add to someone new in an organization, Ty, looking to make sure that their intentions and actions are aligned?
I think, it's funny how we've been counseling clients. It's a lot of what Brittany has noted. We've seen a lot of clients form advisory councils or equity councils, but we've also worked with a few companies who are sort of pushing the envelope a little more and creating the structure to really push the status quo and question and resist policy, cultures, behaviors that have been embedded in these systems for, since organizations' foundings, to have a group of people who are in positions of power and have a voice, and also newer individuals, more junior level employees, right? So almost a task force, an equity task force, who are pushing back and are given the authority to do so, right? So you can have who comes in and maybe doesn't feel comfortable, but feels that, this position is off, or this feedback I got was really steeped in bias and I can't get clarity on what this means, right? And you can have this task force be your voice and be a sounding board as well, right? So that's just another way that we're also pushing organizations to think beyond sort of the standard councils, if you will. Think about how do you empower your employees to really take action, to have a voice, and to have support they need to do so when something does need to be challenged within the company.
I love it. That's back to that collective, which is one of my favorite words
Yes.
and favorite approaches to anything. And not to be remiss, the power of organizing. When you want to change and advance and address any kind of systemic issue, it is the power of organizing as a collective that makes that happen. I could talk to you ladies all day, and I feel like we just got some free nuggets of information because I know you guys aren't cheap and you're not free. So thank you so much for joining us today. I hope everyone can join me in a virtual round of applause for the great nuggets and jewels that you both dropped. And look, you can't see it, but I got pages of like notes. So I got a lot of work to go back and do. So again, thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarah.
With that, what I will
you.
now do is transition to the second part of our panel. I won't introduce the panelists, but it is absolutely unequivocally a pleasure for me to be able to introduce our moderator for today, who is one of my quasi bosses. He serves on our commission as one of our commissioners, helping me to steer and guide and advance this work here at Serve DC. So please join me in welcoming Edward Jones, who is the Vice President of Programs for AppV, which is really focused and centered around philanthropic efforts for the Black community. Commissioner Jones, where are you at? I seen you in the chat. I just don't see your face.
Now you should see me. I was waiting for permission to get in this conversation. So I had to get the leaders, the virtual leaders that be to get me started. So I am really pleased to be with you, Eris, and appreciate your leadership and the whole Serve DC team and all the volunteers throughout the city. It takes all of us. It takes a village to really create the village that we want to see. So thank you for this.
And thank you for accepting. I'm going to sign off and I'm just going to be an observer at this point. And now I'm going to be in the chat.
Okay, that's good. That's good. Thank you.
All right.
That was a dope session. It was powerful. So many kernels of information that should be shared. And so I'm going to bring some other powerful forces in the DMV to this conversation. So I see there's opportunity for a poll that's just popped up. Do we want to do the poll first? I want to invite folks to weigh in on this poll. I've submitted my idea. I think there's, I'm sure I will probably fit in the category of the majority, if I'm not mistaken. Someone's asking a question in the chat, ABFE, this is the Association of Black Foundation Executives. It's our name and who we are. And I think we're going to see what the pollsters have said at this point. A lot of work is needed. So I stand with the majority on that note for sure. 82% folks saying that a lot of work is needed. And I think the reason a lot of work is needed is because a lot of neglect has taken place for way too long. And so I have a couple of folks that are real, I would say radical in all the best ways possible to join me in this conversation, because I think for way too often, being a long-term resident of DC, that we thought Chocolate City had it all. And we're finding, thanks to COVID, thanks to just the ongoing battle for racial equity and social justice and racial justice, that there's still a lot of work to be done in the midst of a pandemic and the midst of gentrification and so many other areas in which we're dealing with. So let me bring to the conversation Aisha Alexander Young. She's the Vice President of Strategy and Equity at the Meyer Foundation, which is a local and large foundation based in DC. That organization invests in equitable solutions that help economically disadvantaged people thrive in the greater Washington region. In her role, she leads efforts to integrate racial equity in all aspects of the foundation's work and reach. She's an active volunteer and strategist to organizations that focus on resourcing, centering, and building power with Black, Indigenous, and people of color movements, more affectionately known as the BIPOC community. Come on, Aisha. And with her, I'm going to bring to the stage, if you will, Timmy Bennett. Timmy's the Director of Policy and Communications at Consumer Health Foundation, which invests in the health and well-being of low-income communities of color in the greater Washington region. And in her role, she focuses on racially equitable policies and systems that enable communities of color to thrive. So there's some synergies in the mission and movement that both these women bring through their organization. So let's do that virtual round of applause, finger snaps for Aisha and Timmy, who I both know. I especially know Timmy well. I know two generations of the Bennett family, thankfully. And so I know that philanthropy, social justice, and Black people is in the blood of my friend Timmy and neighbor. Aisha, I've met you and had a chance to be on panels with you before and appreciate the work that you all are bringing to this conversation, because I think in all my years of working in philanthropy, I think we are in a new era. And I think the era that we're in is going to be led by people like both of you. So let me start by asking you a question. Well, let me first say just welcome to both of you. How are y'all doing today? It's a beautiful day. We survived the floods of last week. Y'all both doing all right?
I'm good. I'm enjoying this good fall weather for the first time. I think it was like 55 degrees this morning.
Yeah, brisk, right? Good for a walk or just staying in the bed. Aisha, you doing all right? I think I got you on now, yeah? Okay, we don't hear you though.
We can't hear you, Aisha.
I want to use this time to kind of test this out and make sure we can hear and see each other.
Can you hear me?
We got you now. That's right.
All right.
All right.
I'm doing all right. I'm happy to be here with y'all today.
Got you. Thank you for being here. And thank you both for co-chairing this new initiative, that we know is necessary. It's not just necessary in the DMV, it's necessary really across the country. And really, to be honest, it's really necessary around the world. This idea of resourcing radical justice is a concept that is in and of itself, in its name, radical. It's radical, but also necessary. And so I'd like one of you to talk to us a little bit to get us grounded in this idea of this group that you are co-chairing. How did it start? And just talk a little bit about what its purpose is.
Yeah. I can start. So we originally came together, a group of funders. We just called ourselves the Monday Group. It was a group of funders, and I think really came out of Timmy's leadership and Unique, her CEO and president's leadership, and really brought a group of funders together to be able to say, listen, COVID is decimating Black communities, both our health and our economy. We are the most impacted by this pandemic. And so we really just felt like we had to come together, a group of funders that weren't in this learning space of maybe it is a race issue, maybe it is a racial justice issue, maybe it's not. We know it's a racial justice issue. Our people cannot wait. Let's come together and put something together that can help really focus on Black, Latinx, and other people of color who are the most adversely impacted by this pandemic. And so we made some initial commitments, and I'll let Timmy talk about those. We made some initial commitments coming together as funders, and we're able to put a couple of $1 million towards COVID recovery and COVID rapid response work that was really focused on Black, Latinx, and other people of color. And then from there, we really started to feel like there was some magic that was happening in this group that was really centered upon people of color and really talking about Black liberation. And we decided that we needed to live beyond this just kind of Monday morning meeting and this coordination of funding to sustain and live on. And we have become Resourcing Radical Justice, a group of funders who are prioritizing Black-led community power, as the center of what's going to be the key to a thriving region. So we are really centering Black liberation, because we know once the most marginalized Black person is free and thriving, every single person in this region is thriving. And so we are centering those folks as how we're deploying our resources and our funding. And we are particularly centering the building of power and leadership in communities, because we know that Black people have the ability and should have the ability to determine their own fate and their own solutions for the problems that are facing us.
And Tim, you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, sure. Like Aisha said, we were originally calling ourselves like the Monday group. So in March 2020, when COVID hit, we felt like at CHF, we felt like we were getting emails from organizations that were already big organizations, we're already getting funding, and we weren't seeing any and we were getting emails from funders, other funders trying to direct funds to these big nonprofits in the region. And we didn't see any funding going to, we knew Black Lives Matter was doing rapid response funding. We didn't see any, we knew there was a mutual aid network, and we didn't see any mention in our sector from our colleagues about them. And so we went to our board, and our board said that we could, to fund some rapid response, to do some rapid response funding. We came up with about 75K, and then we started hitting up our friends in the sector and other funders and bringing on Aisha and Meyer and other colleagues that we've been partnering in racial equity work in the past. And so that Monday group became, I think we ended up coordinating not only rapid response funding, but sustained funding for BIPOC-led organizations with a budget of under $1 million in the region that were doing systems change work and even pivoting to do additionally rapid response work. And then, as Aisha said, after, I think maybe, has it been like maybe 2 months ago, Aisha and I were asked to lead this new transformation of the Monday group to RRJ, which is Resourcing Radical Justice. And in that transformation, we decided to center to shift from centering BIPOC-led organizations to centering Black-led organizations in the region as a path to a thriving Washington area.
That's great. That is great to hear. And I know what a lot of people don't know in the national space of philanthropy and beyond is just how instrumental there have been. We've had some real folks ready to really be radical in philanthropy. Even a few years ago in 2017, APFI with Nat Williams at the Hill Snowden Foundation, which I know is another part of the network, helped to create this case for funding Black-led social change with us. And in that, we intentionally put in the front of this a glossary around some issues like anti-Black racism. These issues that were definitely considered radical when we were talking about them even a few years ago, but have now become really part of the national and global dialogue around addressing these issues. And so you all talk about the work that you all are doing and being really anti-racist grant makers. The idea of focusing on this notion and not shying away from racism, anti-Black racism, in the strategies is really still a radical approach for a lot of organizations. I know when Meyer made its moves, I know when Consumer Health Foundation Unique was brought on board, there's some folks that were really literally, as someone said, at the vanguard of moving this field. And this is work that should have been done decades ago. Honestly, we all know that, right? But we can't, the only thing we can do from the past is learn from it. And so in the space of what you all are doing, what differences or similarities do you see that focuses on this idea of really moving with this anti-racist agenda, this anti-Black racism agenda, moving to a more racially equitable space for the BIPOC community at large, and really taking another step up from just talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, because this is really more than that. Can you talk a little bit about that, Aisha? Uh-oh.
We can't hear you.
I think
you're on mute, Aisha. Yep.
Yeah. Uh-oh, we still lost you.
The thing I will start with, let me know.
There you go, yes.
Okay. So the thing I would really start with is one, I just want to reclaim the word radical, right? And so we use radical most often to mean like something on the fringe that's like crazy and the rest of the majority of people can't get into. But, to quote Angela Davis, radical simply means grasping at the root. And so the reason that Meyer Foundation is focused on being anti-racist and focused on racial justice is because it is not by accident that there is a racial wealth gap. It is not by accident that we are seeing Black communities most adversely impacted by COVID. And so if we want to get to the root cause of what is happening, what all of us philanthropic and charitable organizations say that we want to solve, we have to look at racism as the root cause and grasp at that root. We can no longer, just put a little Neosporin on it and, a little Band-Aid and hope that the broken bone is going to heal. We have to really get to the root cause. And so that's why we focus on racism, and radical, again, it's grasping at the root. It's going to the root cause of all of these situations that we are trying to solve. As far as how Meyer looks at centering anti-racism, we really did a power analysis of ourselves, right, to look at how we function in the community. And so when I think of a foundation, we have 4 roles. So we are a business entity. So how do we spend our dollars? Who do we contract with? We are an employer. How do we hire? How do we make sure that we have effective policies in place to address the trauma and healing that our Black employees go through? Just for a couple examples. Thirdly, we are a grant maker, and so we have completely restructured all of our grant making to be aligned with anti-racist principles. And fourthly, we're a citizen of this community, so how do we use our power and our voice to center Black-led work and Black people? And so I think it's important to think about being anti-racist as not like a state of being, but a process that you're constantly going through. I've been doing this work for well over a decade. There are still things, because we're all socialized in white supremacy, right? There are still things that come up in me and decisions that I make through a white supremacist frame that I have to go back through and kind of analyze for myself. And so it's this constant practice, and it goes back to those values that the first panel spoke about, right? So we've named being anti-racist as a core value and a core point of what we want to be as an institution, and that's a constant way of analyzing ourselves individually, ourselves as an institution, and our power and our relationships and community and our partnerships with other folks.
That's powerful. That's powerful. Timmy, you want to add anything to that?
Sure. Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about CHF's transformation. So we are unique in that we are led by Black women, right? We're also unique in that we're all women. We're all Black women with the exception of our senior program officer who is Filipino. So we're a women of color, like 100% organization. And so CHF stopped doing direct, like we don't fund direct services. We really started focusing on advocacy and systems change work about, I think, 15 years ago. And in 2018, what actually came out of our staff retreat was that not only did we want to continue to focus on systems change, we wanted it to be community centered. And by community centered, how do we do that? And how do we not only be community centered, pipeline, right? Like how can we pipeline community into this field? How can we pull back the veil and be more transparent about what is philanthropy? How was it, like, philanthropy is built on the racial inequities of this country. That wealth is built on that racial inequity. And then on top of that, we said we wanted to be a place of healing for the community. But then we also acknowledged that we didn't know how to heal. We didn't know how to heal ourselves. And so not only being a place for healing for the community, but to heal ourselves in this work that is traumatizing, right? Because we're constantly, as Black women, doing racial equity, racial justice work, the work is traumatizing. So how can we be a place of healing, not only for community, but for ourselves? So we hired a healing justice associate. We started last summer, we kicked off, it was called Foundation Learning Days, where it was a series where we invited community members to learn about the history of philanthropy, learn about the nonprofit industrial complex, learn about what it means to serve on a board, what are fiduciary duties for board members. And then we actually opened up our board to community. So last fall, we brought on 4 community members to serve on our board, not in an advisory capacity, but to be board members. And then and even in that board transformation, that was a transition that was unique to the sector, but also to our board. Because, you know, we always think that our board is like the most progressive and the best board in the world. But then there was some capacity building that we had to do amongst ourselves around what is power and what does it mean to share power, right? And then and also how do we make it so we learned from our Healing Justice Associate, we learned that a lot of the board members, you know, come from upper middle class. And so sometimes in conversations for board meetings, people will be talking about their vacations and things like that, right? And so if you're bringing on community members who, and by community members, we defined community members as BIPOC people who had recent lived experience with homelessness or housing insecurity, underemployment, unemployment, or low wage work, right? And so we brought in these consultants, 2 brown girls who are phenomenal, who worked with our board for about a year before we brought on the cohort of board members, right? To make sure that the community members felt supported, but also board members are able to identify things that might show up as privilege, right? Particularly socioeconomic privilege, because the majority of our board are people of color. And so then another thing which was radical was that we actually pay our community members a stipend to be on our board, and we pay them $10,000 to serve as our board. And then even then, you know, like I said, we think of our board as the most progressive folks. People were like, well, wait a minute, why aren't I getting a stipend, right? Then we had to have a conversation about equality versus equity. We brought in Nat to talk about power, right? And power analysis and how it shows up. And then so there was this transformation, radical transformation on our board. And then we also did a pilot for participatory grant making. So that was so foundational in, or actually eye-opening, not only for the organization, but for our program officers who had been doing this work their entire careers, because in that pilot participatory grant making project that we did, and we had community members come and, you know, choose what organizations were going to get money. About 2 of the organizations that the community members chose were organizations that our program officer wouldn't have selected, right? So we're already learning. And then in 2020, a third of our grant making is participatory grant making and grant funding. So those are some of the transformations that we focus on. Healing Justice, Aisha talked about white dominant culture. We're a Black woman led organization. We're all women of color, but white dominant culture still shows up, right? People would take sick days. And so we, our Healing Justice Associate had us do these audits, these self audits and check-ins, and about what we needed to be supported in our work. And we noticed that little things would come up, we would say, you take a sick day, and then you still be saying, well, oh, you can email me or call me. No, that's that's an attribute of white dominant culture. If I'm sick, don't call me, don't email me, I'm sick, right? Things like that. We also, this summer, every month this summer, we had a week of rest. So not vacation days, right? We love the NAP ministry. I don't know if y'all know the NAP ministry, please follow them, but a week of rest where we are not here and the foundation is paying for us to rest.
Wow.
So those are some of the healing justice practices. And and then we also did with our community members this summer, we kicked off a digital learning lab. It was called a Healing Justice Digital Learning Lab, where community members did mapping of lived experiences. We did resilience practices, learning about resilience practices for COVID and beyond. We did the Seeds of Resistance, where we had a woman come in and she talked about herbs and gardening, and our Healing Justice Associate delivered herbs for this workshop to every participant before that session started. And she talked about how people's faces lit up when they were getting learning about lavender and making tinctures and what to use to healing, you know, with herbs.
Are y'all hiring? No, I'm just kidding. I just, you know, but I think it gets to the heart of just how much more work there is to think differently around what this space is that's called philanthropy. You know, there was a really, I thought the session before this one was so powerful because they lifted up so many ways in which corporate and government entities are being forced to look at race, look at these issues of injustice, and the people that are driving it are the consumers. They are the employees in those spaces, and you all are in spaces where there is definitely a radical approach to looking at the work you do differently. It reminds me of, which I'll post in the chat. I've been doing a lot of chat posting because it's a lot of stuff that needs to be shared. But you know, a few years ago, AFI did this exit interview around why Blacks are leaving the field, and we, in partnership with other identity-based affinity groups, particularly, have found years of frustration in these works. That's why these affinity groups were created, to create better space for justice. So as we want justice within the spaces that we occupy, we also should want it in our community. Aisha, I think you lifted up the important statement around the idea that, you know, a foundation does not just sit in a community, it is also part of the community. The employees live in that community. The same applies with other entities. Can you talk a little bit about some of the ways that you are seeing progress, and then some of the ways that you're seeing still some challenges in this work? Because your work, as you said, and I appreciate how you identify, it's throughout. It's not a matter of just, oh, in the racial department, the racial equity department. You're talking about work inside and outside. So talk about what you're seeing that's working, and then also some of the challenges that you're seeing in this as we move forward toward more equitable community.
Sure. So one thing I would name that I think is working, and Timmy just talked a lot about what CHF has done, and certainly Meyer has done as well, really deep political education. So we've spent a lot of time learning and analyzing, and I also recognize the privilege that we have as a foundation to be able to do so. Like, I don't want us to be, you know, navel gazing, but it's important when you're doing this work, you have to unlearn so many different things. And, you know, we audited ourselves, our organization, looking at white supremacy culture, looking at white supremacy and something different. You know, Timo Kuhn's work, which is fascinating and wonderful, great resource. And so I think seeing more entities, foundations, but other entities in the nonprofit world, just the light switch flicking that, oh, these things that I've been saying, I've been socialized to say these things, and they're not all necessarily true. And there's some things that I need to unlearn. So I think that political education work is something that I see really working. I do think that just the fact that Timmy and I get to exist in this sector as the type of women that we are, saying the things that we get to say, is a mile marker of progress. You know, I'm in recovery from that fatigue that we talked about in the last panel. And part of that recovery that I'm in from that fatigue is being able to show up fully as this Black radical woman that I am in this sector. And so I think that's just a mile marker of success within itself. I do think that one of the things that we struggle with, you notice my title, well, let me go back a little bit. So we see a lot of people and a lot of organizations who are doing and bringing on a person or trying to do some work around racial equity, to bring in a director of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That is a wonderful thing that I see as a sign of progress and something that's working. But you mentioned something, Edward, that I would caution against. One, that person often sits in like this HR seat, right? And that is just one piece, one teeny tiny piece of the work that needs to be done around diversity, equity, and inclusion. That person also often doesn't have any power, any budget, any staff, any resources to move that work around. And so you really need that person in that role to be able to look more comprehensively. But also, that's not part of my role at Meyer. But after the first year, my goal was that it's going to be part of everybody's role. I can be the in-house subject matter expert and you can come to me, but it belongs to everybody. It can't just belong to one person. And then one thing I'll just mention, you'll notice that my title has equity in it, and it does not have diversity and inclusion. I think oftentimes organizations want to do that diversity work and they say, good, we got it, we done, we hired a couple of Black people, yay. But that's not the work. We really I focus on equity, because if you're focused on equity, then diversity and inclusion are natural outcomes. Without focusing on equity, diversity is just with no power, with no justice. It's just tokenism, which is another expression of white supremacy. And so we have to really be careful of that in this space. I see a lot more funders focus on organizing. I see a lot more foundations and organizations focus on building power, which is a shift that I think is extremely necessary. We can't just be funding work that drops in and whenever it wants to and pulls out when it's ready, and does not build any sustainable power and resiliency within community and with community. And so I see that as a real mile marker of progress as well.
So true. And so thank you for lifting up this idea of the change is not going to just sit with any one person. It can't sit with any one person, or that one person will be liberated while everyone else is still oppressing, right? This notion, and then the burden that sits on that person to fix stuff. So watching the Washington football team, they hired some diversity person, and you got NFL folks with diversity people, and you got philanthropy, throwing the names of diversity, equity, inclusion officers and titles all over the place. But the proof, as they always said, is in the pudding. What does it really mean? And someone raised this question around this notion of if we are, if this is a movement or if it's a movement or a moment. And that comes up every time we get into these eras in which there is fighting for justice, fighting for racial justice, fighting for liberation. People want to think it's a cyclical thing because philanthropy, we know, can be somewhat shiny new penny chasers. So when you talk about this idea and the work in which you all are moving, we in our call to action said it's for the long haul. How do you all think you best embed a long haul approach to this work for philanthropy in this region and really philanthropy at large? What are your solutions? And I'll start with Timmy, your solutions for keeping this at the forefront for the long haul.
So for us, like Aisha was talking about, so we don't do diversity and inclusion work. We don't. We do racial equity, and actually, we're actually in strategic planning right now, and we're talking about what does it mean to shift from equity to justice, right? And what does justice look like? And what is the difference between equity and justice? And also what does repair look like? We are equity, you can get to equity without actually acknowledging the atrocities of the past. And we always ground our work in history. We have to know how we got here in order to move forward. And so also, what is beyond acknowledgement, what would reparations look like? What is a reparations portfolio? What does repair look like, not only for government, because government needs to make repair, but also the sector, also, private individuals, private industry. There's a lot of repair that everybody actually needs to be a part of. And I think for us, how do you make this work sustainable is, one, talking about race. It's the number one predictor of all outcomes, right? We cannot sit here and just say equity as if race is not the thing. And then people say, they try to come up with we are very focused on truth telling and acknowledging of the past. And so people will try to get away from race and say, well, let's talk about social equity, right? They have all these other words and ideas of making people more comfortable, right? Because that's where it comes from. One of the characteristics of white dominant culture is this right to comfort. And we are asking folks to be uncomfortable and get comfortable in the uncomfortableness. And for us, you have to have an analysis on race. And so even for our nonprofit and our grant grantees, like we don't have like our grant, like we talk about glass houses. A lot of folks want to look at other organizations or government or certain industries and say, well, you're not doing racial equity work, but they're internally, they're not doing racial equity work either. When you look at who are in positions of power, who is being listened to, who is even the staff, right? And who does your organization look like the communities that you're saying that you're serving? And so for our grantee application is a REIA. A REIA is a racial equity impact assessment. And the whole purpose of a REIA is you can use a REIA, and we advocate using racial equity tools for your analysis. And the whole purpose of a REIA is to see who is benefiting and who is being burdened by that policy decision, whatever it is that you're analyzing. And if Black and Brown community or people of the global majority are being burdened, then we're asking that you redo that decision. And so for me, it's really about having a power analysis and having an analysis on race. And also, if you're talking about equity or justice, if you're not shifting resources, then you're not talking about equity or justice, and you're not doing either. And so we're talking about resources. If you're not doing resource allocation, then you're not about the work.
Thank you for saying, because I had that quote written down here, but you said, yeah, and I was hoping you were going to bring it back up again. I was going to make you bring it back up again. So yes, that's right. Aisha, so from your perspective, share a little bit more on that.
Ooh, so much to be said. So I think one of the things I would say just about the kind of trend chasing of philanthropy, Resource and Radical Justice, the group that Timmy and I co-chair, I take as evidence that this is not going away. Both of our organizations, as Timmy just mentioned, being in their strategic planning and moving from equity to power, we're in the same processes, know and talk about often. And so I think that we're seeing the sector move as a whole, and it's not just like this limited grant fund, this pool of funding here. We have fundamentally changed our entire institution, and it's continuing to change to be anti-racist, to be centered on equity and justice. We don't have like a racial justice fund that's 2% of our giving. It's all of our giving, and increasingly so. And it's not just, as I said, my work, it's all of the organization's work. And it's fundamentally looking at every single role that we have in this sphere as a foundation and as an entity. And so I look at that as evidence that this is not going away, that this is something that we are truly committed to. It has shifted our staff. It has shifted our board. It's shifted how we have invested, and it's shifted how we've interrogated ourselves and the questions that we ask ourselves at the most fundamental level. And ultimately, the work that Timmy and I are doing on resourcing radical justice is to call other foundations in to make sure that they're doing the same, because you cannot claim that you want a thriving region if you are not looking at racism at the core of what's driving inequity, what's driving poverty, what's driving, no matter what issue you care about, especially in this region where the number of white people living in poverty is statistically zero. You cannot address these issues without looking at race. And so the work that we're doing is to really call all these foundations in this region, and through our grant making, to call really these organizations, these nonprofits that are out doing the work. Just because you have Black people as clients does not mean that you are doing racial equity or racial justice work. You just deal with a lot of Black people. But how are you, how are you giving people power? How are you shifting the system so that these people are not in these positions? Because they didn't put themselves there alone at all. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but we're gonna be doing it.
We're gonna be all right.
Yeah. I just want to add, can we add government? I was just going to say, and because we were talking about nonprofits. I got to talk about government, right? And so, And my role actually came about because, so I'm director of policy and communication, but because CHF and my boss realized that government has to be in this conversation. They, created the laws that perpetuate the inequities, right? They are like, private investment is great. We need it, right? But there's nothing like it's not comparable to a public investment. And so policymakers, local governments have to be at the table. And how do we not only bring them to the table, but keep them accountable to the promises, right? Because everybody's talking about racial equity and anti-racism work, but are you also shifting resources? Are you being held accountable? And so not only do we hold them accountable, actually empower community to hold them accountable. And so in my role, we've been working with, as far as DC goes, like McDuffie's office with the REACH Act, that the racial equity legislation had just got $5 million in funding. We're happy about that. We think it's a start, and just a start, and we'll take that. But we know that there's a lot more work to do. But then also working, my office is working with the Deputy Mayor for Education. We've been working with DOEE on developing a racial equity impact assessment for the past 2 years for their sustainability and equity programs. And then also we've been working with Dr. Arno and DC Health, the health equity officer. We also support the chief equity officers in Montgomery County, in Fairfax County, and in the city of Alexandria. We've been instrumental in trying to build coalitions to hold government accountable. So in DC, we have the DC Initiative on Racial Equity in Local Government. In Montgomery County, we have the MORE Network. And so how do we not only partner with government, but also partner with communities and coalitions to hold government accountable? Because after the talking points is done, after that legislation passed, was it implemented? Was it fully funded? And then next year, when we have performance of that legislation, who's going to testify to hold you accountable to those promises that may or may not have been carried out?
So true. And I think too often we tend to forget. I think sometimes philanthropy tries to get a pass and saying, well, we're nonprofits, and nonprofits say this, so we can't really get involved in policy. Well, yeah, absolutely you can. And there's the right ways in which to do it. But even as a voting citizen, you have the right to hold your elected officials accountable. Timmy, I'm glad you brought that up. I know I met you in the hallowed halls of Congress when you were just starting at Consumer Health Foundation, when we were taking an annual trip, this annual meeting where funders from around the country go to talk to legislators. And I bring that up because oftentimes people were talking about the tax policies with them. But we were going there talking about issues such as racial equity. We were talking to them around the idea of being really intentional around how legislators are addressing these issues that are adversely impacting the BIPOC community. ABFE and others in our network, identity-based affinity groups and others are really stepping into this space, I think with even greater and more critical urgency around it. But we need that to happen at the state, federal, and local levels if really we're going to affect change. And what you all are doing is brilliant and continues to be brilliant. And there's room for many more folks. And so if there's a closing word of advice in 1 minute for each of you that you would give to your colleagues on the grant receiving side and on the grant making side, what would those words be? How do you bring them into this conversation?
I'll go. I think it's honestly really I'd say three things for me. One, learn history, right? Learn history, learn the racialized history of America. Two, have an analysis on race. You gotta get comfortable talking about it. It's not going away. It's not gonna go away anytime soon. You gotta get comfortable talking about it. Three, get you some dope partners. I count Aisha and Edward as good friends of mine. I love partnering y'all in this work. We talk about this work all day, every day, because it is our passion. And we're fortunate enough to be paid to do our passion. But it's nothing like having some like-minded friends and partners and co-conspirators in the movement in this work. So build you your team, build you your network.
Thank you, Aisha.
What Timmy said, get yourself a political education, first and foremost, and a political education to the last point that Timmy made around partners. political education, that unlearning and relearning and learning that racialized history, that is best done in community with other people. So you can learn from other perspectives, so your perspective can be challenged, so you can learn from other experiences. So get yourself a political education and do it in community with other people. And have an analysis. You must have an analysis on race, because everything in this country, every issue that we face is racialized. And if you don't understand it, we can never heal. We'll never be better. We'll be here. My daughter that's downstairs, I do this work because I don't want her to have to. I don't want her to be sitting up here 20 years from now doing the same webinar. And so nothing's going to change unless we do this work.
Ashe, for both comments from both of you. At AFI, we do this work. We do it with foundations and trustees and municipalities. We always talk about this has to be habitual. It cannot be a seasonal approach. You can't take one session and feel that you got it all figured out. You can't watch one video or read one book and think you can now change the world. It's ongoing work. Just like anytime, whenever we get back to getting on airplanes again, you get on that flight and every flight attendant gives you the same message. It may come with music, it may come in some other ways, but the idea that you've got to keep learning the same thing, because so often or not, if we don't become intentional around learning and learning how things do change, same processes of racism exist, but they change, they're nuanced, they use different tools.
It adapts.
It's the very same thing. It's at the root of it. And if we don't know that history, we are doomed to repeat it. So I thank you both for bringing this conversation together. I think Serve DC and the idea that we have a space and a platform to have this conversation is a critical one, but it can't stop here. I know we'll be talking offline and talking separately and keeping this work going, but we need everyone in community to be all in about this. And those that aren't in about really affecting and creating a more equitable region, we need to know that too. We need to know who our friends are just as much as our enemies. But we need to keep doing this work. So thank you. I believe I'm to turn it back over to our colleagues at Serve DC. Thank you.
Thank you all. I will not, that was a dynamic conversation. If you are not shifting resources, there is no real commitment to racial justice, period. So we're going to go really quickly into our events and initiatives. We are proud to be a strong partner with DC Startup Week. We know this is geared towards our business community, but we want you to know that there is a space and a platform for nonprofits at this event. And so we will be sharing with you our lessons learned about COVID-19 and what to kind of lean in times of crisis. So we have a stellar lineup and we encourage you to join in on that, which is this upcoming Friday. So please join us. We're really looking forward to that. And then last but not least, we also want to encourage, as we talk about how to reconcile all of these issues, we really have to be counted. And so we encourage all of our viewers and our constituents to please make sure that they have completed their 2020 US Census. And again, we are excited to bring you our fourth conversation, which is really just going to hone in on investing with integrity and inclusion. What rich dialogue we had today. We're going to do it one more time. We're excited to bring this to you. And thank you for all of the support that we've had for this Ready for Recovery series. With that, I am going to turn it back over to Eris T. Scales. And we thank everyone for their time today. Awesome, awesome event.
I can't echo enough how amazing that was. Like literally everything I was going to say in my closing remarks, I've just thrown out the door. And I am just beaming right now with pride and admiration and appreciation for all of today's panelists and for our moderator, our lone man who held it down today. Thank you, Edward. Inserting yourself with this lineup of amazing, dope women. I want to just give a very special thank you to everyone who joined us. I hope you found value in what we shared today. I personally feel like it was a good balance of context and some technical content that you can take back and apply to your journey around advancing racial equity and bringing others along. And I want to make sure that I just give a special shout out as well to the hard work of my team, who is on our partnerships and engagement side, working extremely hard around the clock, late nights, weekends. It's all worth it, I think, to every single degree. And to our production partner, Proactive Business Concepts in Motion, our content partner, Good Insight. Again, it does take a collective, not just to address this work, but to be able to produce as well. This, again, is the third part of a 4-part series. And what we know is that in order for us to really drive change, to enact change, many of the things that we heard today from our panelists must hold true. And for us here at Serve DC, connecting people to purpose, helping to empower and build collectives, being a convener and more of a disruptor even in terms of how we are allocating resources and driving support for our nonprofits and for our communities is really critical, and it's really important to our work, to the Bowser administration, and how we come back collectively to build back better. So if there were, any nuggets that you take away, just a few things I wanted to highlight from our panelists today, right, is that we all play a role in holding each other accountable. So we have to make sure that our elected officials, our government is accountable, our private sector is accountable, that our nonprofits are accountable, as well as our philanthropic community, that there is room, and there's always room for more, to come to the table, to challenge these status quos and to be part of the solutions. And again, our goal is that you leave here today feeling activated and inspired and motivated to want to be at that table with us. You got to learn to unlearn and to be very comfortable with being uncomfortable. There is no way that we are going to improve outcomes and address these disparities if we're not just comfortable acknowledging and accepting where we are and identifying what we still need to address. And that's okay, right? And I love this one, get dope partners, build you a team. None of us can do this alone. And you have to have partners who are aligned, but also partners who challenge you to approach and do things differently. So get dope partners. And last but not least, there is power, again, in the collective. Power in the collective to inform how we shift our programs, how we shift our partners, how we shift our investments, and how we're bringing additional resources to communities and populations who are often overlooked. So again, thank you so much. We hope you will join us for the 29th and that you will continue to follow us on social media to learn about all the other great things that we are bringing to you in our community. Thank you, and please join us and continue to serve DC. Have a good one.